If you've ever played games like Slay the Spire 1 or 2 or Dicey Dungeons, you probably know how addictive roguelike deck builders can be. But SpellRogue takes that formula and throws in something that completely changes how everyone plays out. Instead of using mana to cast spells, you roll dice. And suddenly every single turn becomes this interesting puzzle of luck, planning and manipulating the numbers in your favor. After spending quite a bit of time with it, I think SpellRogue might actually be one of the more interesting evolutions of the deck building roguelike genre. But it's also not perfect. So today we're gonna take a deep look at how SpellRogue works, what makes it special and where it struggles, and whether it's actually worth the normal price of $20. At its core, SpellRogue is a turn-based roguelike deck builder, where you build a set of spells and fight through a series of encounters across 3 acts. If that sounds familiar, that's because structurally it follows a lot of the same ideas popularized by games like Slay the Spire 1 and 2. You move across a node-based map, choosing between enemy fights, elite encounters, shops, random events, or sanctuaries where you can heal. Along the way, you collect new spells, relics, upgrades, gradually turning your character into a ridiculous magical powerhouse. Each run usually takes around an hour, sometimes a bit longer depending on how careful you play and which difficulty modifiers you enable. But where SpellRogue really separates itself from the crowd is how combat works. Instead of spending mana like most deck builders, SpellRogue makes you roll mana dice at the start of each turn. Those dice are then used to activate your spells. Some spells simply require any dice, and the number you roll determines how strong the spell becomes. Others work a bit differently. For example, some spells require specific dice values, while others use a countdown system where the total value of multiple dice needs to reach a certain number before the spell can activate. So maybe you need a total value of 10. You could do that with a 6 and a 4, or a 3, 3, 2 and a 2. This system adds an interesting layer of tactical flexibility, but the real twist is that you are not just stuck with whatever numbers you roll. SpellRogue gives you a lot of ways to manipulate your dice. You can reroll them, you can duplicate them, you can flip them to the opposite side, you can split them, or apply effects that completely change how they behave. So a terrible roll can often be turned into something useful if your build supports it. And this is where the game really starts to shine. Because while there is randomness, yes, absolutely, there's also a surprising amount of player control over that randomness. Once you start building your spell set, combat becomes this constant decision-making process. Enemy telegraph their attacks in advance, so you always know what they are planning to do. That means every turn becomes a little tactical puzzle. Do you spend your dice attacking? Do you build block? Or do you invest your resources into setting up a stronger turn later? On top of all that, both enemies and spells can apply status effects that dramatically change how you approach each fight. Some spells can become broken, meaning you have to spend dice to repair them before using them. Others might gain burn effect, damaging you whenever you cast them. And enemies can apply effects directly to your dice as well. For example, certain enemies might corrupt your dice, forcing them to roll poorly. Others might infect your spells with debuffs that spread across your entire loadout. And some enemies can even turn your own magic into something dangerous to cast. Because of all this, combat rarely feels like you're just repeating the same turn over and over. You're constantly reacting to what the game throws at you. SpellRogue currently features 4 playable characters, each representing a different magical theme. You've got a fire-focused caster who builds devastating burn damage or splits small dice, a nature-based mage that manipulates growth and decay, a water-aligned character focused on poison and defensive play, and eventually a lightning-based character joining in the full release. Each character starts with different spells and abilities, which can influence how your run develops, and there are multiple starting sets. But interestingly, once you get deeper into the game, the distinction between the characters becomes a bit less dramatic, because many spells and mechanics are shared across builds, meaning your strategy often revolves around the spell and relics you find rather than the character itself. Still, there are over 350 spells and more than 145 artifacts in the game, so the number of potential combinations is huge. This is where SpellRogue's biggest strength lies. If you enjoy experimenting with builds, SpellRogue can be incredibly satisfying. Unlike other roguelikes where only a few strategies are viable, SpellRogue tends to allow a wide variety of builds to actually work. You might build around manipulating dice values, or generating huge numbers of dice every turn, stacking countdown spells for massive burst damage, or setting up rituals that grow stronger over time before unleashing them at the perfect moment. The game also includes relics that can completely reshape your build functions. Some might automatically reroll bad dice, others give you extra dice every turn. Some trigger effects when you roll specific numbers. and some allow spells to activate for free every few turns. Because of these interactions, runs can evolve in really interesting ways as you discover new synergies. And that experimentation is what gives the game most of its replay value. I really like the encyclopedia and all the history of which runs succeeded and what you already unlocked and what you already won with is amazing in this game as well, just as a side note. Unlike some roguelike, SpellRogue doesn't rely heavily on permanent upgrades that make your character stronger over time. Instead, progression almost exclusively comes from unlocking new spells, new relics and new characters. So rather than becoming stronger between runs, you're mostly expanding the pool of tools available to you and increasing your knowledge about the game. The game also includes a descent difficulty system, which lets you add modifiers that make runs progressively harder. These can range from enemies gaining extra advantages to mechanics that directly interfere with your build. For newer players, the base difficulty is fairly approachable compared to, for example, Slay the Spire. But once you start stacking modifiers, the challenge ramps up quickly, and at a higher level you will need a really solid understanding of the game's systems to succeed, and also a really good build. Visually, SpellRogue has a pretty distinct style. The art is colorful and detailed, with nicely animated spells and clear visual feedback for most effects. The interface is also very clean in my opinion, which is important in a game like this because you're constantly juggling numbers, dice values and spell effects. For the most part, it communicates information clearly and keeps things readable, even when your board gets complicated. Audio is solid, the music fits the atmosphere well, and the sound effects help reinforce the impact of spells without becoming overwhelming. So, all good here. That said, SpellRogue does have a few weaknesses. The biggest one is probably enemy variety. After enough runs, you'll start recognizing most of the encounters fairly quickly. While bosses do have some variation, the overall pool of enemies isn't huge. And because the game's maps are fairly consistent between runs, that sense of discovery can fade a bit over time. Another criticism some players have mentioned is that the difficulty scaling can feel uneven. The early game tends to be quite forgiving, while higher difficulty levels sometimes rely heavily on modifiers that restrict builds or introduce frustrating mechanics, especially if you have multiple together. So instead of fights becoming more interesting, they sometimes just become harder in ways that feel a bit artificial. Finally, runs are relatively long. At around 1 to 2 hours, losing near the final boss can feel pretty rough. Though to be fair, that's fairly common for this type of roguelike. Who is this game now for? SpellRogue is definitely a game that appeals most to players who enjoy build crafting and experimentation. If you like discovering new combinations and slowly mastering a system over many runs, there's a lot to enjoy here. But if you're looking for a roguelike with consistently changing environments or huge amounts of content, this might not be the one you sink 100 hours into. Its longevity mostly comes from replaying runs with different builds, not from endless new encounters. So overall, SpellRogue is a really interesting take on the roguelike deck builder formula, and I really like the systems behind it. The dice mechanics add a unique layer of strategy that makes every run feel a little different, and the build crafting potential is genuinely impressive, especially if you want to unlock and play with every single relic once. It's not perfect, enemy variety could be better, and the difficulty system isn't always perfectly balanced, but if you enjoy games like Slay the Spire 1, 2 or Dicey Dungeons and want something that pushes the formula in new directions, SpellRogue is definitely worth checking out, especially if you love experimenting with builds and finding clever ways to turn bad luck into powerful plays. If you enjoyed this review and want to discover more roguelikes like this one, let me know in the comments what hidden gem I should check out next. And as always, thanks for watching.